Selma Lagerlöf was a Swedish writer whose stories have been translated into many languages. A universal theme runs through all of them, a belief that the essential goodness in human beings is awakened through love and understanding. The story is set amidst the mines of Sweden, rich in iron ore, which figure large in the history and legends of that country. The story is told somewhat in a manner of a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a man who went around selling small rat traps of wire. He made them himself at odd moments. Odd over here means irregular, unusual, or uncommon. He made them himself at odd moments from the material he got by begging in the stores or at the big farms. But even so, the business was not specially profitable, so he had to resort to both begging and petty thievery to keep body and soul together. The expression to keep body and soul together means to survive. Even so, his clothes were in rags, his cheeks were sunken, and hunger gleamed in his eyes. Once there was a man who went around selling small rat traps of wire. He made them himself, but his business was not so profitable, so he had to resort to. Resort to means to turn for help, or in other words, you could say, to fall back upon. So, as his business was not so profitable, he had to resort to both begging and stealing to make both ends meet. To make both ends meet means to survive. His clothes were in rags, his cheeks were sunken, and hunger gleamed in his eyes. His life was sad and monotonous. No one can imagine how sad and monotonous life can appear to such a vagabond who plods along the road left to his own meditations. Monotonous means uninteresting, unexciting, dull, boring, or tiresome, and a vagabond means a wanderer, nomad, or a tramp. To plod means to walk slowly with heavy steps, especially when you are tired, and meditations means in his own thoughts. But one day this man had fallen into a line of thought which really seemed to him entertaining. He had naturally been thinking of his rat traps when suddenly he was struck by the idea that the whole world about him, the whole world with its lands and seas, its cities and villages, was nothing but a big rat trap. It had never existed for any other purpose than to set baits for people. It offered riches and joys, shelter and food, heat and clothing, exactly as the rat trap offered cheese and pork, and as soon as anyone let himself be tempted to touch the bait, it closed in on him, and then everything came to an end. The world had, of course, never been very kind to him, so it gave him unwonted joy to think ill of it in this way. Unwanted means unusual or unaccustomed. It became a cherished pastime of his during many dreary ploddings to think of people he knew who had let themselves be caught in the dangerous snare, and of others who were still circling around the bait. Dreary means dull and gloomy. Snare is a trap for catching animals. One day he was struck by an idea that the whole world is nothing but a big rat trap. It sets baits for people. Bait is an allurement or a temptation. For example, if you put or place food in a rat trap to tempt the rats in order to catch them, by putting food in a rat trap, you are basically attracting or tempting rats to come and have the food. And as soon as they will come to eat, they will get trapped. So bait is an allurement or a temptation. One day he was struck by an idea that the whole world is nothing but a big rat trap. It sets baits for people by offering riches and joys, shelter and food, heat and clothing, exactly the way cheese and pork are placed in a rat trap to tempt the rats. And as soon as anyone let himself be tempted to touch the bait, it closed in on him, and then everything came to an end. One dark evening, as he was trudging along the road, he caught sight of a little grey cottage by the roadside, and he knocked on the door to ask shelter for the night. Nor was he refused. Instead of the sour faces which ordinarily met him, the owner, who was an old man without a wife or child, was happy to get someone to talk to in his loneliness. Immediately he put the porridge pot on the fire and gave him supper. Then he carved off such a big slice from his tobacco roll that it was enough both for the stranger's pipe and his own. Finally he got out an old pack of cards and played mules with his guest until bedtime. The old man was just as generous with his confidences. Confidences means private matters. So the old man was just as generous with his confidences as with his porridge and tobacco. The guest was informed at once that in his days of prosperity his host had been a crofter at Ramshire Iron Works and had worked on the land. Now that he was no longer able to do day labor, it was his cow which supported him. Yes, that Bossy was extraordinary. She could give milk for the creamery every day, and last month he had received all of 30 kroner in payment. The stranger must have seemed incredulous, for the old man got up and went to the window, took down a leather pouch which hung on a nail in the very window frame, and picked out 3 wrinkled 10-kroner bills. These he held up before the eyes of his guest, nodding knowingly, and then stuffed them back into the pouch. One dark evening he was walking slowly along the road when he saw a little grey cottage by the roadside. He knocked on the door to ask shelter for the night. The owner was an old man without a wife or child. He willingly let him in and was happy to get someone to talk to in his loneliness. He served him porridge, and then he carved off such a big slice from his tobacco roll that it was enough for both of them. And finally he got out an old pack of cards and played mules with his guest until bedtime. The host had been a crofter. Crofter is a person who owns small farm, especially in Scotland. So the host had been a crofter at Ramshire Iron Works in his days of prosperity and had worked on the land. But now, as he was no longer able to do day labor, it was his cow which supported him. This extraordinary cow could give milk for creamery every day. Creamery is a butter factory where milk and cream are made into butter and cheese. The old man informed the stranger that last month he had received all of 30 kroner in payment. The stranger must have seemed incredulous. Incredulous means a person having doubts. So the stranger must have seemed incredulous, for the man got up and showed three wrinkled 10 kroner bills, which he took out from the leather pouch, which was hanging on a nail in the window frame. The next day both men got up in good season. In good season means they got up quite early. The next day both men got up quite early. The crofter was in a hurry to milk his cow, and the other man probably thought he should not stay in bed when the head of the house had gotten up. They left the cottage at the same time. The crofter locked the door and put the key in his pocket. The man with the rat trap said good-bye and thank you, and thereupon each went his own way. But half an hour later the rat-trap peddler stood again before the door. He did not try to get in, however. He only went up to the window, smashed a pane, stuck in his hand, and got hold of the pouch with the 30 kroner. He took the money and thrust it into his own pocket. Then he hung the leather pouch very carefully back in its place and went away. As he walked along the money in his pocket, he felt quite pleased with his smartness. He realized, of course, that at first he dared not continue on the public highway, but must turn off the road into the woods. During the first hours, this caused him no difficulty. Later in the day it became worse, for it was a big and confusing forest which he had gotten into. He tried, to be sure, to walk in a definite direction, but the paths twisted back and forth so strangely. He walked and walked without coming to the end of the wood, and finally he realized that he had only been walking around in the same part of the forest. All at once he recalled his thoughts about the world and the rat trap. Now his own turn had come. He had let himself be fooled by a bait and had been caught. The whole forest with its trunks and branches, its thickets and fallen logs, closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison from which he could never escape. The next day both men got up early. The crofter was in a hurry to milk his cow. The other man probably thought he should not stay in bed when the head of the house had gotten up. Both of them left the cottage at the same time. The crofter locked the door and put the key in his pocket. The man with the rat trap said good-bye and thank you, and thereupon each went his own way. But half an hour later the rat-trap peddler returned to that little grey cottage, smashed the window pane, and got hold of the pouch with 30 kroner. I think I forgot to tell you that kroner is the currency of Sweden. He took out the money and put it in his pocket. Then he hung the leather pouch very carefully back in its place and went away. As he walked along with the money in his pocket, he felt quite pleased with his smartness. He realized that he dare not continue on the public highway and decided to go through the woods. For the first few hours he had no difficulty, but later in the day it became worse, for it was a big and confusing forest which he had gotten into. He tried to walk in a definite direction, but the paths twisted back and forth so strangely. He walked and walked without coming to the end of the wood, and finally he realized that he had only been walking in the same part of the forest. All at once he recalled his thoughts about the world and the rat trap. He had let himself be fooled by a bait and had been caught. The whole forest, with its trunks and branches and fallen logs, seemed to him like an impenetrable prison from which he could never escape. Impenetrable basically means unpassable, and here the prison is used as a metaphor for the forest. It was late in December. Darkness was already descending over the forest. This increased the danger, and increased also his gloom and despair. Finally he saw no way out, and he sank down on the ground, tired to death, thinking that his last moment had come. But just as he laid his head on the ground, he heard a sound, a hard, irregular thumping. There was no doubt as to what that was. He raised himself. Those are the hammer strokes from an iron mill, he thought. There must be people nearby. He summoned all his strength, got up, and staggered in the direction of the sound. Staggered means tottered. The Ramshire ironworks, which are now closed down, were not so long ago large plants with smelter, rolling mill, and forge. In the summer-time, long lines of heavily loaded barges and scows slid down the canal which led to a large inland lake, and in the winter-time the roads near the mill were black from all the coal dust which sifted down from the big charcoal crates. Smelter is extraction of metal from ore by melting. Barge is a large boat with a flat bottom used for carrying goods and people, and scow is also a kind of flat-bottomed boat. It was late in December. Darkness was already descending over the forest. This increased the danger, as well as his gloom and despair. Finally, when he saw no way out, he sank down on the ground, tired to death, thinking that his last moment had come. But as soon as he laid his head on the ground, he heard the sound of the hammer strokes, and thought that surely there must be some people nearby. He summoned all his strength, got up, and staggered in the direction of the sound. During one of the long, dark evenings, just before Christmas, the master smith and his helper sat in the dark forge near the furnace waiting for the big iron, which had been put in the fire, to be ready to put on the anvil. Every now and then one of them got up to stir the glowing mass with a long iron bar, returning in a few moments, dripping with perspiration, though, as was the custom, he wore nothing but a long shirt and a pair of wooden shoes. All the time there were many sounds to be heard in the forge. The big bellows groaned, and the burning coal cracked. The fireboy shoveled charcoal into the maw of the furnace with a great deal of clatter. Maw over here means the mouth of the furnace, and clatter means a rattling sound. Outside roared the waterfall, and a sharp north wind whipped the rain against the brick-tiled roof. It was probably on account of all this noise that the blacksmith did not notice that a man had opened the gate and entered the forge until he stood close up to the furnace. Surely it was nothing unusual for poor vagabonds without any better shelter for the night to be attracted to the forge by the glow of light which escaped through the sooty panes. Sooty means covered with soot. While burning something, a black powdery substance is released which is known as soot. So surely it was nothing unusual for poor vagabonds without any better shelter for the night to be attracted to the forge by the glow of light which escaped through the sooty panes, and to come in to warm themselves in front of fire. The blacksmith glanced only casually and indifferently at the intruder. Intruder means the invader or the trespasser or a person who comes uninvited. He looked the way people of his type usually did, with a long beard, dirty, ragged clothes, and with a bunch of rat traps dangling on his chest. He asked permission to stay, and the master blacksmith nodded a hearty consent without honoring him with a single word. Consent means permission or approval. Haughty means arrogant. The tramp did not say anything either. Tramp means vagabond or a wanderer, nomad. He had not come there to talk but only to warm himself and sleep. He reached a forge. Forge is a blacksmith's workshop where metals are shaped by heating them in a fire and are then hit by the hammer. So he reached a forge where the master smith and the helper sat near the furnace waiting for pig iron. Pig iron is the crude iron extracted from the mines. So he reached a forge where the master smith and the helper sat near the furnace waiting for the pig iron to be ready to put on the anvil. Anvil is a heavy iron block on which blacksmith works. There were many sounds. The big bellows groaned. Bellows is basically an equipment or a device which is used for blowing air into fire to make it burn better. So there were many sounds. The big bellows groaned, the burning coal cracked. The fire boy shoveled charcoal with a great deal of clatter. The waterfall roared, and a sharp north wind whipped the rain against the brick-tiled roof. It was probably on account of all these noises that the blacksmiths did not notice that a man had opened the gate and entered the forge until the stranger stood quite close up to the furnace. The blacksmith glanced only too casually and indifferently at the intruder with a long beard, dirty, ragged clothes, and a bunch of rat traps dangling on his chest. Intruder means an invader or a trespasser or a person who comes uninvited. The peddler asked for the permission to stay, and Master Smith nodded an hearty consent without even honoring him with a single word. Hearty consent means giving a consent or an approval or permission while showing one's superiority. The peddler too did not say anything, for he had not come there to talk, but only to warm himself and sleep. In those days the Ramshire iron mill was owned by a very prominent ironmaster whose greatest ambition was to ship out good iron to the market. He watched both night and day to see that the work was done as well as possible, and at this very moment he came into the forge on one of his nightly rounds of inspection. Naturally, the first thing he saw was the tall ragamuffin who had eased his way so close to the furnace that steam rose from his wet rags. Ragamuffin is a person in dirty torn clothes. To ease his way means to move unnoticed. The ironmaster did not follow the example of the blacksmith, who had hardly deigned to look at the stranger. To deign means to condescend. In simple words, you can say to behave towards somebody as though you are far more superior than them. He walked close up to him, looked at him over very carefully, then tore off his slouch hat to get a better view of his face. "But of course it is you," he said. "How you do look!" The man with the rat traps had never before seen the owner of Ramshire Iron Mill, and did not even know what his name was. But it occurred to him that if the fine gentleman thought he was an old acquaintance, acquaintance means a known person, he might perhaps throw him a couple of kroner. Therefore he did not want to undeceive him all at once. Undeceive means to tell that an idea or a belief is mistaken. "Yes, God knows things have gone downhill with me," he said. "You should not have resigned from the regiment," said the ironmaster. "That was the mistake. If only I had still been in the service at the time, it never would have happened. Well, now, of course, you will come home with me to go along up to the manor house and be received by the owner like an old regimental comrade. That, however, did not please the tramp. "No, I couldn't think of it," he said, looking quite alarmed. He thought of the 30 kroner. To go up to the manor house would be like throwing himself voluntarily into the lion's den. He only wanted a chance to sleep here in the forge and then sneak away as inconspicuously as possible. Inconspicuously means without getting noticed. The ironmaster saw him in the uncertain light of the furnace, and mistook him for his old regimental comrade, and told him that it was a mistake on his part to have resigned from the regiment, and asked him to come home with him. The man with the rat traps had never before seen the owner of the Ramshire Iron Mill, and did not even know what his name was. But it occurred to him that if the fine gentleman thought he was an old acquaintance, he might perhaps throw him a couple of kroner. Therefore he did not want to tell him that he was mistaken, but to go along up to the manor house and be received by the owner like an old acquaintance did not please the tramp one bit, and he did not agree. He thought of 30 kroner, and thought that going to the manor house would be like throwing himself voluntarily into the lion's den. He just wanted to sleep in the forge and sneak away the next morning. The ironmaster assumed that he felt embarrassed because of his miserable clothing. "Please don't think that I have such a fine home that you cannot show yourself up there," he said. "Elizabeth is dead, as you may already have heard. My boys are abroad, and there is no one at home except my oldest daughter and myself. We were just saying that it was too bad we didn't have any company for Christmas. Now come along with me and help us make the Christmas food disappear a little faster." But the stranger said no, and again no, and the ironmaster saw that he must give in. "It looks as though Captain Wonstale preferred to stay with you tonight." But he laughed to himself as he went away. It was not more than half an hour before they heard the sound of carriage wheels outside the forge, and a new guest came in. But this time it was not the ironmaster. He had sent his daughter, apparently hoping that she would have better powers of persuasion than he himself. The ironmaster assumed that he felt embarrassed because of his dirty rags. He said that his wife Elizabeth was dead, his boys were abroad, and only his oldest daughter was with him. He invited him to spend Christmas with them. The stranger said no again and again, and finally the ironmaster saw that he must give in. The ironmaster told the master blacksmith that Captain Von Starley preferred to stay with him that night. He laughed to himself and went away. Half an hour later, the sound of carriage wheels was heard outside the forge. But this time it was not the ironmaster, but ironmaster's daughter. He had sent his daughter, apparently hoping that she would have better powers of persuasion than he himself. She entered, followed by a valet. Valet is a personal attendant. She entered, followed by a valet carrying on his arm a big fur coat. She was not at all pretty, but seemed modest and quite shy. In the forge, everything was just as it had been earlier in the evening. The master blacksmith and his helper still sat on their bench, and iron and charcoal still glowed in the furnace. The stranger had stretched himself out on the floor and lay with a piece of big iron under his head and his hat pulled down over his eyes. As soon as the young girl caught sight of him, she went up and lifted his hat. The man was evidently used to sleeping with one eye open. He jumped up abruptly and seemed to be quite frightened. "My name is Edla Wilmanson," said the young girl. "My father came home and said that you wanted to sleep here in the forge tonight, and then I asked permission to come and bring you home to us. I am so sorry, Captain, that you are having such a hard time." She looked at him compassionately with her heavy eyes, and then she noticed that the man was afraid. Either he has stolen something, or else he has escaped from jail, she thought, and added quickly, "You may be sure, Captain, that you will be allowed to leave us just as freely as you came. Only please stay with us over Christmas Eve." She said this in such a friendly manner that the rat-trap peddler must have felt confidence in her. "It would never have occurred to me that you would bother me with yourself, miss," he said. "I will come at once." She entered, followed by a valet carrying a big fur coat. She introduced herself as Edla Wilmanson. She noticed that the man was afraid. She thought that either he had stolen something or had escaped from jail. However, she assured him that he would be allowed to leave them as freely as he had come. She addressed him as Captain and requested him to stay with them over Christmas Eve. She said this in such a friendly manner that the rat-trap peddler at once agreed to go with her. He accepted the fur coat, which the valet handed him with a deep bow, threw it over his rags, and followed the young lady out to the carriage, without granting the astonished blacksmith so much as a glance. But while he was riding up to the manor house, he had evil forebodings. "Why the devil did I take that fellow's money?" he thought. "Now I am sitting in the trap and will never get out of it." The next day was Christmas Eve, and when the ironmaster came into the dining room for breakfast, he probably thought with satisfaction of his old regimental comrade, whom he had run across so unexpectedly. "First of all, we must see to it that he gets a little flesh on his bones," he said to his daughter, who was busy at the table. "And then we must see that he gets something else to do than to run around the country selling rat traps. It is queer that things have gone downhill with him as badly as that," said the daughter. "Last night I did not think there was anything about him to show that he had once been an educated man. Have gone downhill means that things have worsened for him or they have deteriorated." "You must have patience, my little girl," said the father. "As soon as he gets clean and dressed up, You will see something different. Last night he was naturally embarrassed. The tramp manners will fall away from him with the tramp clothes. He accepted the fur coat which Valley handed him with a deep bow and followed the young lady out to the carriage without granting the astonished blacksmith so much as a glance. But on his way to the manor house, the peddler had evil forebodings. Forebodings means predictions. So on his way to the manor house, the peddler had evil forebodings. He questioned himself as to why he robbed the crofter's money, and now he was all trapped and would never be able to get out of it. Just as he said this, the door opened, and the stranger entered. Now he was truly clean and well dressed. The valet had bathed him, cut his hair, and shaved him. Moreover, he was dressed in a good-looking suit of clothes, which belonged to the ironmaster. He wore a white shirt and a starched collar with whole shoes. But although his guest was now so well groomed, the ironmaster did not seem pleased. He looked at him with puckered brow. Puckered means a wrinkled brow. And it was easy to understand that when he had seen the strange fellow in the uncertain reflection from the furnace, he might have made a mistake. But now, when he stood there in broad daylight, it was impossible to mistake him for an old acquaintance. What does this mean? He thundered. The stranger made no attempt to dissimulate. He saw at once that the splendor had come to an end. It is not my fault, sir, he said. I never pretended to be anything but a poor trader, and I pleaded and begged to be allowed to stay in the forge. But no harm has been done. At worst, I can put on my rags again and go away. Well, said the ironmaster, hesitating a little, it was not quite honest either. You must admit that, and I should not be surprised if the sheriff would like to have something to say in the matter. The tramp took a step forward and struck the table with his fist. Now I am going to tell you, Mr. Ironmaster, how things are, he said. This whole world is nothing but a big rat trap. All the good things that are offered to you are nothing but cheese and rinds and bits of pork set out to drag a poor fellow into trouble. And if the sheriff comes now and locks me up for this, then you, Mr. Ironmaster, must remember that a day may come when you yourself may want to get a big piece of pork, and then you will get caught in the trap. The ironmaster began to laugh. That was not so badly said, my good fellow. Perhaps we should let the sheriff alone on Christmas Eve. But now get out of here as fast as you can. Just then the stranger entered in a good-looking suit of clothes, a white shirt with a starched collar, and whole shoes. Although he was well groomed, the ironmaster did not seem very pleased. He realized that he had made a mistake last night. Now, in broad light, it was impossible to mistake him for an old acquaintance. The stranger did not attempt to dissimulate. Dissimulate means to hide or conceal. He explained that it was not his fault. He never pretended to be anything but a poor trader, and even requested the ironmaster to let him stay in the forge. He was ready to put on his rags again and go away. But just as the man was opening the door, the daughter said, I think he ought to stay with us today. I don't want him to go. And with that she went and closed the door. The daughter stood there quite embarrassed and hardly knew what to answer. That morning she had felt so happy. When she thought her home like and Christmassy, she was going to make things for the poor hungry wretch. She could not get away from the idea all at once, and that was why she had interceded for the vagabond. Interceded means intervened. I am thinking of the stranger here, said the young girl. He walks and walks the whole year long, and there is probably not a single place in the whole country where he is welcome and can feel at home. Wherever he turns, he is chased away. Always he is afraid of being arrested and cross examined. I should like to have him enjoy a day of peace with us here, just one in the whole year. The ironmaster mumbled something in his beard. He could not bring himself to oppose her. It was all a mistake, of course, she continued, but anyway, I don't think we ought to chase away a human being whom we have asked to come here and to whom we have promised Christmas cheer. You do preach worse than a parson, says the ironmaster. I only hope you won't have to regret this. The young girl took the stranger by the hand and led him up to the table. Now sit down and eat, she said, for she could see that her father had given in. The man with the rat trap said not a word. He only sat down and helped himself to the food. Time after time he looked at the young girl who had interceded for him. Why had she done it? What could the crazy idea be? After that, Christmas Eve at Ramship passed just as it always had. The stranger did not cause any trouble because he did nothing but sleep. The whole forenoon he lay on the sofa in one of the guest rooms and slept at one stretch. At noon they woke him up so that he could have his share of the good Christmas fare. But after that he slept again. It seemed as though for many years he had not been able to sleep as quietly and safely as here at Ramshire. In the evening, when the Christmas tree was lighted, they woke him up again, and he stood for a while in the drawing room, blinking as though the candlelight hurt him. But after that he disappeared again. 2 hours later he was aroused once more. He then had to go down into the dining room and eat the Christmas fish and porridge. As soon as they got up from the table, he went around to each one present and said thank you and good night. But when he came to the young girl, she gave him to understand that it was her father's intention, that the suit which he wore was to be a Christmas present. He did not have to return it, and if he wanted to spend next Christmas Eve in a place where he could rest in peace and be sure that no evil would befall him, he would be welcomed back again. The man with the rat traps did not answer anything to this. He only stared at the young girl in boundless amazement. The next morning, the ironmaster and his daughter got up in good season to go to the early Christmas service. Their guest was still asleep, and they did not disturb him. When at about 10 o'clock they drove back from the church, the young girl sat and hung her head even more dejectedly than usual. At church she had learned that one of the old crofters of the ironworks had been robbed by a man who went around selling rat traps. Yes, that was a fine fellow you let into the house, said her father. I only wonder how many silver spoons are left in the cupboard by this time. The wagon had hardly stopped at the front steps when the ironmaster asked the valet whether the stranger was still there. He added that he had heard at church that the man was a thief. The valet answered that the fellow had gone and that he had not taken anything with him at all. On the contrary, he had left behind a little package which Miss Wilmington was to be kind enough to accept as a Christmas present. The young girl opened the package, which was so badly done up that the contents came into view at once. She gave a little cry of joy. She found a small rat trap, and in it lay 3 wrinkled 10-kroner notes. But that was not all. In the rat trap lay also a letter, written in large, jagged characters. Jagged means uneven. So in the rat trap lay also a letter written in large jagged characters. Honored and noble miss, since you have been so nice to me all day long, as if I was a captain, I want to be nice to you, in return as if I was a real captain, for I do not want you to be embarrassed at this Christmas season by a thief, but you can give back the money to the old man on the roadside who has the money pouch hanging on the window frame as a bait for poor wanderers. The rat trap is a Christmas present from a rat who would have been caught in this world's rat trap if he had not been raised to captain, because in that way he got power to clear himself. Written with friendship and high regard, Captain One Starley.